Okay, so I thought I'd make a video about a project I've been working on over the last few months, and the project is a tool called vopono, and this allows you to run certain applications through VPN tunnels whilst the rest of your system is unaffected. So, for example, you can run kind of one specific application through your VPN provider, maybe Firefox, and your kind of other applications just run over your normal connection. So this is really useful if for perhaps you're kind of using video conferencing at the same time but want to run kind of one application over the VPN for its own connections. So vopono includes kill switches built in for both WireGuard and OpenVPN, so both protocols are supported. And it also has kind of configuration generation for these providers listed here. So that includes Molvad, Azure VPN, Mozilla VPN, Tiger VPN, Proton VPN, and private internet access. And you can also provide custom configuration files with the custom argument. And so that would allow you, if you perhaps use another VPN provider, to just download either their OpenVPN or WireGuard configuration files. In that case, it'd be with wg-quick is a kind of syntax we use. And you can provide those configuration files with the custom argument and use it just like you would for these other providers as well. So I'll go through another example in a moment, but here's kind of a screenshot showing how you can use kind of multiple VPN connections at the same time. So here we have 3 browsers running at the same time, and you can see we're connecting via a different VPN server for each of these browsers simultaneously. So in terms of the provider support, different providers kind of provide different support for the protocols. So, for example, Molvad provides both OpenVPN and WireGuard support. And overall, I think Molvad would be the most recommended VPN provider. Azure VPN is also very good and provides kind of the same support for both protocols. And then private internet access in vopono can only generate the OpenVPN configuration files. I know it now has WireGuard support, but I no longer have a private internet access account, and so I haven't been able to kind of write the code to generate this configuration files. Tiger VPN is OpenVPN only. Proton VPN is also OpenVPN only from the provider itself, and Mozilla VPN is actually WireGuard only and built on top of Molvad. But that's another option. Though note, this Mozilla VPN is also only available in certain countries. So let's have a look at an example of what we might use vopono for. So kind of where I live at the moment, a lot of websites are blocked. So if we were to try to access Library Genesis, for example, we get kind of a 404 error. So this isn't a real 404. The website is actually being blocked by the internet service provider, as we'll see in a moment. So, okay, so we try to access the website and it's blocked. Now let's use vopono to get around this problem. So here we'll run, so we use vopono exec to kind of start an application. I specify the provider will be Azure VPN, which is kind of the current provider I'm using. The server will be in Sweden, so it will choose one of the servers in Sweden according to the config files. And then I tell it to run Firefox Developer Edition. So one thing to note is when you're running a browser, you want to run kind of separate browsers because they can share processes. So for example, if I was to run also Chromium here, it might actually not run through the VPN because it would effectively be using the same process as the other Chromium instance. So that's one thing to bear in mind. You can get around it also by forcing them to be in separate processes, but then you need to set up separate profiles in order to do that. So now let's try to access Library Genesis here. And you can see as we are now running through the VPN, we can access this directly. And so if we go to check our IP address here, we can see this is probably a mistake here. This should really be in Sweden, but we're connecting via kind of this Swedish VPN. And if we were to go to kind of like Google and so on, it would think we are in Sweden. So here we have access to Library Genesis. Another website which is blocked is Sci-Hub. So we can check if we try to access here, sci-hub.se, And you see here we have access to Sci-Hub. If I go back to my normal kind of non-VPN connection, you can see we get the same suspicious 404 error. So this is how it's very useful directly for kind of users to be able to access possibly blocked websites in your country, depending on which country you live in. So that's kind of exactly how you can use vopono. Now, one thing I do want to mention here is that recently there's been kind of this sort of idea that you shouldn't use VPN services. So you may have seen this very popular GitHub gist, which says don't use VPN services. No, seriously don't. And basically the idea here is that you can't guarantee that your VPN provider isn't logging what you do. And this is true, right? There's no way you can guarantee that they aren't actually recording what you do. But really this depends on your threat model. It's not in the VPN provider's interest to log that, to log everything you do and link it to you. It would cost them kind of more money to do so. It's more effort to do so, and it could possibly make them kind of legally liable in the case they had to hand over such logs. And I think there's a lot of confusion about kind of what logging means. So a VPN provider may log the fact that you connected to the VPN such that they can stop you, for example, connecting 100 times at the same time, like simultaneously. And a lot of VPN providers will have a limit on that, so you can't share your credentials with kind of all of your friends and family and have everyone use the one account. But that's very different from logging what you actually access when you're on the VPN. And as far as I know, kind of all of these providers I've listed here, it's never been proven that they're logging kind of what people do. And so here it's really about the threat model. I mean, I just demonstrated that these websites here are blocked where I live. So if I wanted to access these websites, kind of the only other option I have here, which is mentioned here below, is to use Tor. But if I was to use Tor, then it would be very slow. So you might not be able to kind of launch downloads via Tor, the connection is much slower. And really it's not, if I just want to access these websites and kind of do what I want, then I don't need to use Tor to do that. So the VPN provides a good middle ground of good speed and reasonable kind of privacy and security versus using Tor, where possibly you get better privacy, but it's kind of a lot less practical. And this is also true for kind of downloading larger files, or using BitTorrent and stuff like this. So hopefully that kind of covers why VPNs are still useful. And so let's look at how you'd actually install vopono. So here there are some installation instructions. So if you're on Arch Linux like I am, it's actually available in the AUR. There's both a Git package to install it directly from Git you can use kind of an AUR helper like Yay to do so. Alternatively, you can use the bin package if you don't want to compile vopono from source. And you can use vopono, just the vopono package itself, which will install from source from the last release. It won't be kind of the master branch, but it'll be the last release available. So we can have, I close this now. So as I close the browser, it will now have killed the network namespace. I wasn't running it in verbose mode with the -v flag, so I don't actually see that it closed the network namespace, but we'll assume that worked correctly. So now, just to show what's available here in AUR, if I search vopono, we can see the three possible packages here. So that's for the AUR. There are also releases available on GitHub. So here are some installation instructions for installing on the Raspberry Pi, where you need to use the ARM package. It's actually packaged for Debian. There are also packages provided for kind of non-ARM Debian distributions such as Debian and Ubuntu, and RPM packages provided for Fedora and OpenSUSE. And then for kind of other Linux distributions, you can install it directly either with Cargo, just using kind of cargo install in the local directory, and you can just kind of pull it from GitHub to do that. So that's kind of easy enough for installing it. Then you need to kind of configure your VPN provider to be used with vopono. So I've already done this, which is why I can just immediately use my Azure VPN account without having to enter my credentials. But if I was a new user, I would need to to do that. So let's have a look at what that looks like for this case. So we type vopono sync, and we get a menu that asks us kind of which provider we want to enter for. We can choose multiple providers. Here I'll choose Azure VPN. It asks me for my username and my password. So it will now set up the set up the WireGuard configuration first. And now it will set up the OpenVPN configuration. For the OpenVPN configuration, we actually have some options, so we can choose if we want to use UDP or TCP. I'll just say UDP. And it will go. So it's actually in the background, this is connecting to kind of Azure VPN's website, getting the configuration files, and ultimately setting up the configuration files for us. Here I have to enter my username again. Now this is because for some providers, the OpenVPN credentials may differ from kind of the account credentials you might need to use to access, for example, the configuration files hosted by the provider. In this case, for Azure VPN, they're actually the same. So I use exactly the same credentials for OpenVPN as I do to kind of log in on the website and everything. So let's just do that. So it's a bit unfortunate I have to enter this twice, but currently that's what it is. And we can now see, okay, it's up all of the configuration for us. And so now let's just test that that's working correctly. So we can go here, we'll run it. Let's just run normal Firefox because I think I have this set up correctly. So we'll go and use Azure VPN's check to see whether this is working correctly. As you can see, it's now in Swedish. So here somewhere there should be like some sort of service check. Everything is in Swedish. Security check, here we are. And you can see we get all green across the board. Everything's working correctly. We're not leaking WebRTC because Firefox has been configured for that. Our VPN is connected. We're not leaking DNS. And I know that inside of vopono we have set up the firewall rules to act as a kill switch, so that if I kill OpenVPN, for example, if I were running for OpenVPN, or here if I kill WireGuard, then the connection will die. So you'll never kind of accidentally be connected in the clear. So this is like the simple case of just running like an application directly. And so here, for example, you don't just have to use browsers, right? So we could come here and we could go and run transmission GTK, kind of a torrent client. And since this namespace, the network namespace, applies for all child processes, we also don't need to worry about kind of what the process does. All of its child processes will also be running through the VPN. So here, we could run this and our torrents would go via the VPN. And one thing to note is that in the case of Molvad, they actually have a special torrent check. So I no longer have a Molvad account at the moment, but I've tested this in the past and this worked correctly. So you can actually, in your torrent client, go and set up one of these magnet links, and it will tell you here on this page whether you're kind of connecting through the VPN or not via kind of when you're using the BitTorrent protocol. So that's very useful, and if you're a Molvad customer, I absolutely recommend verifying that if you're going to use BitTorrent. Molvad's also good because it also supports forwarding ports, and this is also possible to configure in vopono. When you do the Molvad configuration in vopono sync, you can specify kind of which ports you've enabled to forward in Molvad, and that will allow you, if you want, to set up port forwarding, which could also be useful for certain applications. But it should be noted that isn't actually required to use BitTorrent, for example. So I guess this is all good in terms of launching applications, but we can actually do even more than that. So this is fine if I'm running it on my local machine, but I may want to actually run this kind of headlessly, perhaps on a server, or even on a Raspberry Pi. As we saw, we can run this on a Raspberry Pi. Perhaps we want to kind of run our torrents from the Raspberry Pi and have that connect via the VPN, but also be able to run other services on the Raspberry Pi that perhaps don't connect via the VPN. And vopono can be used to do that as well. So one example of that would be running the transmission daemon. Now, running these daemons is a bit more complicated. So here in the vopono repository, there is a user guide. So I'll just open this here. And this covers in much more detail kind of a lot of the features that are available inside of vopono. And here there are some examples for dealing with kind of daemons and servers. And one example here is this transmission daemon. So we can run this. So basically, this is slightly trickier than kind of the general application case. And so here we run vopono. The K flag is for keep alive. So we maintain a namespace alive, even though the process ID is going to change because the daemon will actually spawn like another daemon and it doesn't keep the same process ID. So for now, we need to just keep the namespace alive so it doesn't immediately kill the namespace thinking that the process has ended. -F is for forwarding ports. So this allows us to forward a port from inside the namespace to be available outside the namespace. And by default, vopono will also run a TCP proxy such that this port is proxy to the local host. So I can then connect on my host machine to just 9091 and it will kind of forward me through to the transmission daemon running inside of the network namespace. So let's run this example. So this is now running and you can see it's a bit hard to see because it's very zoomed in, but this will stay alive until we send kind of a SIGINT with Control and C. So we can now go here, like to our general, my normal browser running on my machine, and I can connect into the transmission daemon. So this is the web interface, and here you can see I have my Arch Linux torrent there, and this could be running. So this whole vopono and the transmission daemon could be running on a Raspberry Pi on my network, for example. I could run this exactly as I have done, and then the only difference would be here, instead of connecting to localhost, I'll connect to the Raspberry Pi's IP address on my network, and I would need to make sure that this is accessible on the network, and then you'd be able to do this exactly the same, and the actual kind of transmission itself would be running inside of the network namespace and running through the VPN, just as we showed before. So this allows you to kind of run like transmission, in this case, kind of a torrent server, kind of to go and download your BitTorrent, so you could just leave it running all the time, and the whole time it will run with the kill switch, so you can guarantee that it's running through the VPN provider and it's kind of all taken care of. So that's very useful. Now the only pain of this at the moment, so I'll just kill this window here. The only pain at the moment is here I kill vopono. We can see it kills the network namespace. So there will be no connection. The kill switch is there and the daemon will have lost its connection. But the problem we have is that it will actually stay alive because of the fact that it changes the process ID. So this process ID is not the kind of original process ID that vopono will have seen. You can see here it launched in 43569 and it's actually running 43572 in the end. Now, because we don't want to code in to just kill kind of everything that's named transmission daemon, because that, depending on what you run, could cause other problems. For now, we just have to manually kill this. So, I mean, this is easy enough. We can come here and just go kill 43572, and then it's no longer running. So that's one thing to bear in mind when you're using kind of daemons and the keep alive flag, that perhaps will be improved in a future version if possible. So that's all good. Now, another very common kind of setup that people have is instead of using instead of using this whole thing with network namespaces and so on, people might run a proxy server inside a container or possibly on another machine, and then just use kind of everything through the proxy, and then the proxy is going through the VPN and they don't need to worry about changing stuff on their machine. And we can do exactly the same setup with vopono. So here what we can do is run Proxy, which is a TCP proxy that also blocks ads, and we can run that inside of a network namespace. And then just as we did for the transmission daemon, we can proxy out this port. So we forward through the port, it's 8118 in this case, and then that will be reflected on our local host machine, and we can specify that as a proxy to use in Firefox, for example, and connect as usual. So let's run this example. So this is a bit more involved, right? So we have to have the keep alive flag because again, it's a daemon, it's going to change its process ID exactly as before. In this case, we have to specify to run it as root. So vopono, when it creates a network namespace, has to escalate its privileges to root. So we can then later run the application as root if we don't want to step down to another user, which would normally be your currently running user. And the reason we do that is because Proxy actually has to kind of chroot into the Proxy user, which is set up when you install Proxy, and we need to provide the config file and so on. So it's slightly more complicated than the previous example, but this should work. So if we just copy this here, you can see here I ran it with the verbose flag as well, so we'll get kind of every message. Here we get some firewall rule that was already existing. This is probably due to the order in which it runs the firewall rules, so it has to double check that the chain actually exists at the time. So this is all good. We have our Proxy running. So now we need to run an application to use this proxy server. So one thing we can do, just as a simple example, is we can run Firefox again. And now Firefox here is running outside of the network namespace, right? So if I go to, if I search for some way of checking my IP address here, so you can see here, it knows that I'm in Spain. And now if we go here, we go to our configuration, and we tell Firefox to now use that proxy server that we're running inside of vopono. Then here we set, okay, localhost 8118, which is the correct port. And this should all be fine. And now again, if we just come here, copy this, and it's going to be in Spanish, but whatever. And now you can see it says we're in Norway. And so our connection, even though this application is running on the host machine, we're actually proxying through the proxy that's running inside of vopono. And again, this proxy, this Proxy proxy in this case, could be running on a Raspberry Pi on your network that you just leave running the whole time. And then you could kind of connect every device to use this proxy server. So you could go to your mobile devices, a bit like people do with the Pi-hole for DNS lookups, and say, use this proxy server on my network. And then that way you could proxy kind of lots of devices on your network through a VPN by kind of running this on a Raspberry Pi or on some machine. And you don't need to alter, aside from setting the proxy, you don't need to alter any configuration on those devices. So this is so a lot of people do this with running like a Docker container, for example, or an LXC container to do this, but vopono provides you kind of an even easier way of doing this without having to maintain a container by using network namespaces. So as I mentioned before, so these come from the user guide. There are a lot of details here. So one thing to note is that as we launched the transmission daemon, we have to make sure it allows external connections, because now our connections from the host machine will appear external to inside the network namespace. And the same is also true of Proxy. So here in the configuration, we actually have to go and make sure that it allows external connections again for exactly the same reason. But this would also be true kind of when you're running it, if you did run it on your local network, for example, on a Raspberry Pi or something like that, you'd again want to make sure you do the same configuration. So if you do use vopono, I recommend reading through kind of the user guide as well as the basic README. And this should cover kind of most of the use cases. If you have any issues, please create an issue on GitHub. And if you wish to contribute, please create a pull request. There's also this short README on contributions. So one area that would be very good to have more contributions would be on VPN providers. I can't go and pay for every single VPN provider out there. I don't know every VPN provider that people are using. And so it would be great if people could kind of contribute their own VPN providers that they're using if they aren't included here already. So the way to do that is documented here. There are some common traits that are used inside the Rust code. So this is all written in Rust. And so that tries to make it kind of as simple and kind of standardized between different providers, such that you have kind of enough ability to customize the way configuration files are generated, but also having a standard interface in the end, such that vopono can work with lots of different providers. So that covers kind of how to use vopono. There are still a few issues open. So aside from this issue of having kind of more VPN providers. There's always more things to add. For example, certain providers, I think Azar VPN is one of them, support DNS crypt. And this is something that is not kind of currently used inside of vopono, but support could be added. Another current issue at the moment, which should hopefully be fixed soon, is with pulse audio tunneling. So in that case, it's a bit like running a server inside of vopono, but in this case, the server is running on the host, and the vopono application needs to access that server. And so it's kind of the reverse problem of our current port forwarding and TCP proxy. And so this is a bit more tricky because we want to run, if we want to proxy this locally to kind of inside of the network namespace, then we need to run the TCP proxy server inside the network namespace. And so this is a slightly harder problem, but will hopefully be solved soon. And yeah, so if you kind of like this tool and are able to use it, please give a star to the repo and contribute more code for new providers if you're able to. And as always, if you kind of enjoyed this video and learned something from it, please like the video and subscribe to the channel.